Well, your dinners are making their way around the room. Enjoy them as they reach your tables. Please continue to eat, but we are going to move on to our keynote speaker this evening. Just before we do, thank you so much. Don't know about you, I've had an absolutely fantastic time today. I've loved engaging with the range of material that's been put out there. Particularly enjoyed getting my geek on a few times, and a few people have asked me, you really seem to resonate with what's going on. And so I just wanted to paint a little bit of a picture as to why I'm enjoying an event like today just so much. A little bit about myself that some of you might not know, but before I became the major media megastar that that was not the bit you were meant to laugh at, buddy, that you know me to be. I was, in fact, I was a geeky maths nerd, was my background before I got into media and things like this. This photo here is probably the highlight of my time as a public mathematician. I got to speak at the TED Talks. Who's heard of the TED Talks? You know, the TED Talks, ideas worth spreading, life hack, culture, that sort of stuff. I got to speak at a TED Talk, not a TEDx. This is like the big TED in the United States. Back in 2014, I gave a 17-minute TED Talk on gigantic prime numbers and how mathematicians hunt them down through the infinity, the counting numbers spreading on forever. I was chatting with the team here. Unfortunately, with the time strictures tonight, I won't have time to re-deliver my 17-minute TED Talk on giant prime numbers. And as I say that, I can sense the sadness that's sweeping across the room. But if you want to grab me later, I'm happy to absolutely bore the socks off you about it. But just wanted to give you a bit of an insight into how a maths nerd brain works. And I think it might also shed a bit of a light into the way that our keynote speaker's brain works. We who see the world numerically just see things a little bit differently. Here's an example for you. Of course, we're in 2025, yeah? Are we having a good 2025? It's going all right. You just passed the halfway point in 2025. I don't know if you, but is it just, you look at a number like 2025, you think that number just looks awesome. 2025, there's something about that, yeah? Perhaps it's this. It turns out, now you can, if you want, you can take your calculator, turn it on, turn your phone on your side, you can convince yourself of this. Or if you've got a son or daughter in about year 8 or 9, they should be able to do it with pen and paper. 2025 is 45 times 45, right? Or as we maths nerds like to say, 45 squared is 2025. And I can read the room. I know just now you're thinking, my God, this is going to be the most boring 20 minutes of my life. But look at this. 45 is 20 plus 25, right? So 20 plus 25 squared is 2025. It is 1,000 years before that will happen again with the year format, okay? Now, yeah, I know. Now, looking at that fills me with an almost sexual excitement. And who am I kidding when I say almost? It just trips my trigger, okay? That's why I'm so excited about the guest speaker we're about to meet, because like me, he sees the world through numbers, he sees the world through data, he tells great stories sewn out of the magic of the numbers around us. To introduce him, please welcome to the stage from our sponsor tonight, Infosys, Andrew Groff, their Executive VP Asia Pacific. To say a few words, give Andrew a big round of applause. And Andrew, who's our guest speaker?
Bujari Gamarua. Welcome all to the dinner this evening. It's great to have you all here. I hope you've enjoyed the dinner, enjoyed Braz, and I know you're going to enjoy this next speaker. I'd like to start, of course, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of where we're meeting this evening and pay our respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'd like to thank their elders past and present for looking after these lands and these waterways for many, many generations. And on behalf of Infosys, it's indeed a pleasure to host you here this evening after what has been a really fascinating day, extremely interesting sessions, very candid conversations right across the agenda on navigating disruption. Many of you will know Infosys. We're a global leader in next generation technology and consulting and digital services. And coincidentally, our tagline, as you can see, is also about navigating your next, which is very much about succeeding through disruption in these times. And there was a lot of discussion today about disruption, about the fact that it's a constant, the fact that it's constantly changing, and in those discussions, how we navigate that disruption. And indeed, that journey of navigation, Infosys has a long history of collaborating with many financial services companies around the world. And Adam mentioned this document that you might see on your table. This Infosys Bank Tech Index is actually a survey that's done every 6 months, and it's been completed by senior executives from over 400 banks right across Asia Pacific, Europe, North America, Middle East, Africa. So 400 of the largest banks around the globe. And if I look specifically at this latest edition and zero in on Australia, one of the key findings, and it kind of resonates with some of the sessions today, is that the largest Australian banks have shifted their strategic focus. They've shifted it from cost optimisation to innovation and growth. And we talked a lot about that innovation and growth and care today. But the interesting thing is, if I go back just 6 months earlier, in the November 24 edition of this, Australian banks were actually in a slightly different place. All around the rest of the globe, the number one priority in terms of IT spend was around innovation and growth, but Australian banks were still saying their top concern at that time was cost optimisation. So just in the last 6 months, we've seen a shift so that whilst cost optimisation is still clearly there, but the priority focus has now gone into innovation and growth. And that's a significant change. And we can see that in many of the discussions today. And indeed, we see that with the banks we work with all around the globe, banks we work with here in Australia that are driving customer acquisition, that are driving product innovation, that are driving digital engagement and experience. And we can see that they're leveraging the cloud, they're leveraging AI to do that sort of work. In fact, another thing about the AI, lots of conversations on that today, of course, already. Over a quarter of the banks in Asia-Pac have indicated that AI is generating most business value in 3 key areas: fraud detection, customer service, and business operations. And to do that, you've got to collaborate across the enterprise. And that enterprise-level collaboration, it's critical. In our AI Business Radar, another survey, it also talked about the other important thing in terms of AI success at an enterprise level is ensuring our workforces are ready and ensuring we've got trained staff and customers and our workforce are ready. And we've seen that in our own journey as an organisation as we've transformed ourselves to be an AI-first organisation. When we work with banks here in Australia, or indeed many global banks around the world, like Citizens, JP Morgan, Danske Bank, to give an example. Collaboration is a large part of navigating disruption, and that's been talked about a lot today. And really, if you think about it this evening, we all come together as a group. It's not about individual institutions, it's about a collective force. It's a community, one here that's sustaining economies, one that's enabling dreams, and importantly, as was discussed a lot today, it's ensuring that it's done with safeguards and stability and sustainability going forward. So to navigate disruption, we must collaborate, not just in our own organisations. Of course, it is important to do that in our own organisations, but we've got to do that across the industry, and we've got to do that right across the economy. So I really want to recognise and applaud and thank all the people in this room, across the banks, the technology companies, the government. We've all got to work together to really shape the future of financial services in Australia. And in terms of preparing for the future, it's really my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this evening, Simon Kuestenmacher. Simon is a director and co-founder of the Demographics Group. He's a columnist for the New Daily. He contributes to The Australian. He's authored 3 books on maps, and his posts reach over 35 million people around the globe every month, which actually makes Simon one of the top 10 global influencers in data. And from our work with Simon's organisation and his colleague, Bernard Sort, I can say that this is a team that has an incredible skill. Adam was talking about data, and this team has an incredible skill to unpick data, to talk about trends, and to help us navigate that future as we all navigate together for businesses, for people, and for the communities around us. So please join me in giving a great big warm welcome to Simon Kuestenmacher.
Just fantastic. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. Enjoy your dinners, have more wine. There is plenty good stuff to discuss, even though you might be depressed occasionally when you look at the newspapers and probably the phones these days, and you think about the future of Australia, the future of the global economy. There is so much bad news out there. There are stories about trade wars, tariffs, climate change, wars. This is a bit depressing, isn't it? But I would say we have quite a few things going for us in Australia still. Let's imagine you are a migrant that can literally pick and choose where in the world they would want to live, or imagine you are a bag of money that could be invested in any corner of the globe. Well, where would you want to be invested? Where would you want to live? Probably you'd want to pick a country that doesn't see population decline, that is either stagnant or it sees growth, because that means you don't need to worry too much about the negative impacts of an aging population. That's quite nice. So let's kick out all those shrinking countries. We got rid of most of Europe. Catch you later. Also, where would we want, what would we probably want? We want to live in a developed country. It's really nice to have all those basics of life guaranteed. That makes it easy. And I would want to live in a country that is at least as developed as Samoa. There's nothing special about Samoa. It's just a straight 6 on the Human Development Index. I feel these days I sometimes actually need to declare it. Personally, I'm also a huge fan of democracy. It's quite nice to have your voice heard, to have things like the rule of law guaranteed. It's pretty cool. So let's kick out all those countries that are less democratic than Bangladesh. Again, nothing special about Bangladesh. It's just a straight 7 on the Global Democracy Index. It's quite nice to be in a sizable economy, because we want to make sure that we have enough jobs to pick and choose from, that there are enough investment opportunities in the country, a bit of diversity of range and so forth. And can you call yourself an economy if you're smaller than the Gold Coast? Absolutely not. We kick out all the countries with economies smaller than the Gold Coast. But the overall size of the economy isn't all. We want to make sure that a fair chunk of this money goes our way. We want a GDP of capita that is at least 20,000 US dollars, that kicks out even more places. You can't see this on here, but there are still quite a few microstates on this map. We need to get rid of them, and it's absolutely unfair to call yourself a country if you're smaller than Adelaide, so let's kick out all those places as well. And now we are left with 12 countries, a couple of small fry European countries, the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore is in there, Israel is in there, probably not the most popular destination right now. But what you see, most importantly, Australia is here in the top 10. You rightfully might argue that these filters that I set here are quite arbitrary. And to be fair, they are. But trust me, I played this game on many a Saturday night with many different data sets. It is utterly impossible to kick Australia out of the top 10. It can't be done. This remains a highly attractive investment destination. It remains a highly attractive destination for migration. So really, this was an absolutely unnecessarily long-winded way of saying, she'll be right. The Australian business model continues to deliver wealth and prosperity in the future. What is the Australian business model? Well, Australia runs an extremely simplistic business. We do 4 things and 4 things alone that matter to anyone around the world. We sell stuff that we dig out of the ground, mining. We sell stuff that we grow on top of the ground, agriculture, and then we entertain a few people, tourism, and we educate a few folks with our universities, international education, and that's it. That is literally all we do that matters to the rest of the world. We export absolutely nothing else that matters. It's not all that much. We're not a very complex economy. There are a couple of wonderful rankings that we are always listed in Australia. For example, the Global Innovation Index. Considering how many of us go to university, we send half of our year 12s to uni, and we have all those international students, 1.1 million international students in Australia right now, and we keep falling down those rankings. Year after year, we become less innovative. It's not very cool. Well, let's look at the Economic Global Complexity Index, where we rank a wonderful 98th. Wow. Just behind the economic powerhouse of Uganda. Again, we keep falling down this list here. We don't run a very complex ship. That's not very helpful, isn't it? If only we were to become more economically diverse. I'm at countless events each year where we talk about diversifying our economy. And I would highly welcome this, but I think that the idea is pretty much laughable at this stage. If we wanted to diversify the economy, the obvious candidates would be value adding to our existing strengths. This would be value added manufacturing in agriculture, meaning food production, or value added manufacturing in mining, smeltering and so forth. This makes no sense considering how high our electricity prices are. Our electricity prices should be at least half, probably a third of what they are. Before we have that, manufacturing makes no sense whatsoever in Australia, so forget about this. But Australia, lifestyle, a lifestyle-obsessed country, a beautiful country. We should attract all those footloose industries, your IT sectors, all these kind of jobs. They could be anywhere. And if the US is throwing a bit of a hissy fit with their migration, immigration status and so forth, we could attract those people. A logical argument. But again, our housing is probably about 2 times too expensive to actually pull people in at scale. So what will we do? I would argue we probably continue to fall down those rankings a bit. Is this going to be economic misery for us? Not necessarily, because those 4 dumb things that we do, they continue to deliver wealth and prosperity, because none of them are at strategic risk. If you get nervous about all those terrible developments around the world, these will be things like global trade wars. Well, consider what our mining sector does. The world sees about 50 years worth of human population growth, and about 100 years worth of urbanization is still left in the tank there. That's what mining is needed for. Also, all the consumption that is still in there, that's mining. Agriculture, global warming, absolutely real phenomenon. Many of our large food-growing regions around the world are at severe risk of minimizing their yields. Sounds not that dramatic, but it means that it is very, very dangerous news to be in the bottom 2 billion people of the planet as food prices keep rising. Yeah? But we look at this from an Australian perspective where, hey, we export food like crazy. This is good news for us, economically speaking. Then, of course, the Asian middle class, what is called the global Asian middle class, people that are rich enough to consume on a global level, that continues to mushroom like crazy. These people can consume our stuff. And they will continue to consume our stuff, meaning tourism and international education. So our dumb model continues to deliver wealth. Keep this in mind as the good news, because we're now diving deeper into the here and now of Australian demographics. This is the absolutely most simplistic way that I could show you the Australian population as of right now. Babies on the left, 100-year-old folks on the right-hand side chart. Simple graphic. There's quite a bulge there in the 30s. That is the millennial generation. People born in the 80s and 90s, the by far biggest cohort in this country right now. But that's the status quo. How boring is that? We want to know about the future. We want to know, let's say, what 10 years Australia will look like. And forecasting our population only a decade ahead is super easy, because we know exactly how many babies you're going to make this year. We also know who of you isn't going to make it till next year. And then as a country, we literally dictate the migration intake. So it's pretty simple guesswork to figure out how many people there will be in Australia in 10 years' time. First observation, top right-hand corner, we'll be adding 3.6 million people, maybe even closer to 4 million people to this country. Well, a rising tide does lift all boats to a certain degree. These are more people to sell stuff to sell services to. These are people who need bank accounts. That is a positive story. As we've seen in the first world map that I showed you, plenty of areas don't have this kind of population growth to keep the engine ticking along. It's a rather privileged position, if you will. But you, of course, also realize that this population growth here isn't evenly distributed across the whole age spectrum. Certain segments see much less growth than others. For example, overall, the under 18-year-olds, they stagnate. Yes, we see more babies in 10 years' time than we do now, even though you constantly hear about the ever-shrinking birth rates in Australia. Well, that's quite simple. If the biggest generation ever, millennials, makes babies at a low rate, you still have very busy maternity wards. And so for the next 12 years, that's how much baby making is left in the millennial tank. For the next 12 years, the midwives will be very busy. In 12 years' time, once they are finished, the millennials, and the smaller cohort starts making babies, the midwives might occasionally get a weekend off, but not for the next decade. And then once we hit 18, we really see the power of migration play out. Australia, of course, is a migration nation. 70% of our population growth comes from overseas. Only 30% is homegrown. That is more people being born than people die. And the migrants that we take in are almost exclusively 18 to 39. That covers about 80% of our migration. Makes sense, huh? Half of the migrants are international students these days, 18 to 22, 23. And then the skilled migrants that we take in, we want them as young as possible because we want them on cheap starter wages. We want them to be productive worker bees for as long as possible into the future so that they fill up their super accounts and pay for their own damn retirement. So that works out. So we constantly rein population on the 20s and 30s, essentially, on this chart. That leads to a situation where despite us pushing the big millennial generation from the 30s into the 40s in the next decade, we still see population growth in the 30s. And that is a truly unique demographic setup that is absolutely a reserve for very, very few migration nations around the world. It's very special to have this. We are, of course, now facing a decade where the single year of age to record most growth will just happen to be the 43-year-olds. And isn't that great news? Because 43, statistically speaking, just happens to be the exact time of your life where you spent more money than ever before, ever after. Makes sense, huh? At 43, you had a couple of promotions, so your income is nice and high. You have a lot of money to spend. At 43, you already had all the kids that you will ever have, so there's a lot of costs associated with those kids. And at 43, you definitely haven't paid down your mortgage. So every dollar that you earn at age 43, straight out the door, back into the economy. Sucks for all the 43-year-olds, but it is great news for all those businesses that help you to fill your house with crap. Bed Bath & Beyond's, Barbecue Galores, Harvey Norman's, IKEA. They will have a wonderful decade with us pushing the biggest generation ever through the highest spending phase of the life cycle. Great for them. Who doesn't like this, of course, are our friends at the RBA. Remember that the RBA still looks at the inflation rate and they go, oh, that's a bit concerning. And this is, of course, hyperinflationary if we spend like crazy. The RBA only has a single tool, the cash rate, to counteract this. And so they need to keep the interest rates elevated for longer to make sure that they don't spend that much. Turns out, though, you can put the interest rate at whatever number you want. Millennials spend every dollar they have regardless. So that means you need to keep the interest rate higher for longer. And who suffers in the process? It's the bottom third of society. You absolutely bleed them dry in the process. Well, at least, aren't we retiring the baby boomers? That's good. That's good news, traditionally speaking, because back in the day, when you actually stopped drawing a wage, you instantly turned into a poor penny-pinching pensioner. You became deflationary. Not the baby boomers. They actually increased their spending in retirement in all categories that we measure, except for one that's charitable giving, that's significantly down. But overall, we are facing a decade where the biggest and the richest generation still happily spend money. That, to me, tells me that the interest rates want to be higher rather than lower in the next decade. I'm not telling you that there won't be any rate cuts our way this year, anything like this. And I know that there is much, much more that flows into the interest rates. But this is me adding my demographic view of the interest rates. And I promise this is the most dangerous part of the evening, where the demographer talks about economics. We officially close this down now. This was, the water is getting too hot. So what you also see on this chart on the right-hand side is quite clear. We are aging. That's boring. You read this a million times. But I want to draw your attention to the far, far right-hand side of the chart where it says 85. We need to talk about 85-year-olds. 85 is another very important statistical year for you to be aware of, because it is called the median age of death. You know exactly what this means. This means that half of you, and it's that half, you don't make it. Sorry. Congratulations to the surviving 50%. Well done, you. Unfortunately, half of you mob, and it's the front half of you guys will need assistance with activities of daily life. You will need care on a daily basis. in the next 15 years, so a tad more than I'm showing on this chart, in the next 15 years, we're doubling the 85 plus cohort from 590,000 people today to just over 1.2 billion people by 2040. And this is 100% guaranteed to happen because we're not importing old people. They're already here. They're just a tad younger. So that means we must double the aged care system in 15 years. Will we achieve this? Spoiler alert, hell no. We won't. So therefore, my great financial advice to Australians is do not end up in the bottom third of society, because there is no one in the private or public system who will take care of you. It is out of the question at this stage that this will have a chance of succeeding. That, of course, means you will fully rely on your family to take care of you. Does everyone have family? Does everyone have family who would take care of you, that are even in the country? This is a train wreck in the making. Why am I ruining your lovely dinner with my horrible retirement story here? Well, because the shortage of aged care workers that we're facing, that is only the most intense skills shortage that we are facing. The skills shortage that you and your business are facing, that is actually universal, because it is baked into the demographic pie. What are we doing? We are retiring the big boomer cohort. So we push a big cohort out of the workforce. We take in a smaller cohort on the other side. I don't know, you look at this chart and you go, that doesn't look right. Look at this. The pile on the left, that's much higher than the pile on the right-hand side. Surely we'll be fine. It's like, don't be too sure about this. We are hiding 1.1 million international students there in the early 20s, and despite the popular narrative of them just coming here to drive Ubers, they do not contribute to the workforce at scale. We must not count them in our job forecasts. Of course, also now, we are sending more than half of our year 12s into the university system. That means they hang out on campus for just one more degree, one more degree, one more degree. They only start contributing to the workforce at scale in their mid to late 20s. So we also need to discount for them. So as if this imbalance wasn't bad enough, remember this big gray pile of millennials? Another 12 years worth of baby making. This means they go on parental leave. They leave the world of work at least for a little bit. The skills shortage is here to stay. This, of course, means that all those fun buzzwords that you've been throwing around during the day, AI, automation, robotics, these things are our friends. This gives us a fighting chance to actually fill all those jobs and skill gaps. That is absolutely a wonderful development. This is something that needs to be embraced. This will not lead to high unemployment in Australia. Remember, if we were ever to risk higher unemployment, we would just take in a couple of fewer migrants. Problem solved. I don't see any plausible scenario in Australia where unemployment would rise significantly. So that's a positive development, I would argue. It's like, oh, this was so many depressing news in such a humble chart. There's more. Turns out that the skills shortage actually has an evil twin. It is called the retirement cliff. The retirement cliff measures what share of the workforce is already of retirement age. That's 5% of Australian workers are already 65 and older. But it also, more importantly, measures what share of our workers are nearing retirement. So they're 55 to 64. So in 10 years' time, they fall off the proverbial retirement cliff. Let's understand, and 15% is rather stark already, that we're losing 15% to retirement age in the next 10 years. That is reasonably high. But let's think about a couple of jobs that are absolutely vital to keep the Australian economy going. We, of course, start with baristas. Oh, thank God. So at least they're not running out of baristas. So there is a bit of good news. Let's look at a job like plumber, just a stand-in for all other trades jobs. That's all right. That's not too dramatic. Well, but you, of course, must remember that this is a physically very taxing job. Plumbers tend not to retire at 65, or bricklayers for that matter. You retire a bit sooner. So that's probably a bit more scary than it might look at first time. Accountants, that's not scary. Plus, the accountants will be replaced with AI, so that's fine. Same goes for management consultants. Catch you later. So remember aged care workers? Not only do we have not enough already, not only do we need to double the cohort, we also lose heaps of them, 20% to retirement age until then. And we haven't even spoken about the god-awful retention rate of this job. This is getting worse and worse and worse the more we look at this. Look at a job like commercial cleaners. Absolutely every one of you guys employs commercial cleaners left, right, and center to keep your offices sparkling. We run out of them very, very fast. At the very least, this means that operational costs will go up because the wages for these kind of workers will go up. Worst case scenario is that you better need to get good with a mop because nobody else is doing the cleaning. Truckies. We already have a shortage of 40,000 truck drivers, 200,000 exist, 40,000 truck drivers are meant to be missing. We are retiring an absolute bucket load of them. 26% of them are nearing retirement. This number is even scarier if you remember that until very, very recently, we proactively bullied every single truck driver out of the workforce once they hit 55, because that's when their bad back claims went up, and we didn't want them as an expensive asset on the books. Now we are begging them to stay on longer. In the next 10 years, we are forecast to need another 40,000 truck drivers on top of our lack of 40,000 people. That is difficult. That means the costs will probably go up for trucking. That means operational costs go up. That's annoying. Plus, there is no technological solution in sight here. Self-driving vehicles, van-sized, car-sized, they will be around in 10 years' time. Industry opinion, not my opinion, in 10 years' time, there will not be a single self-driving truck in Australia outside of a mining site. So that's something. That's just a cost that Australian business needs to eat up. That's very difficult. Handy persons, these are the jack of all trades, tradies that duct tape anything that might wobble in your office or in your factory floor. We run out of them left, right, and center. What does that mean? Well, it obviously means that you do need to employ more expensive, more highly skilled tradies. Costs go up. And now we finally need to talk about Australia's oldest profession. Well, not the oldest profession. The profession with the oldest age profile, and that's, of course, bus drivers. That is an outrageously old job. Granted, bus driving is a popular second career for truckies who don't want to have the long haul, the long nights away and so forth. But ultimately, we're running out of bus drivers left, right, and center. And this is absolutely god-awful if you remember how car-dependent our cities are. That there are many, many poor and elderly people who, to get around, rely on a bus network. If you are secretly hoping that the bus network gets better, please rethink this. And as a local government area or as a town, always put your hands up to get any kind of pilot project happening for self-driving van-sized vehicles, because they are technologically possible. So there might be a technological light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, for bus drivers. We are a migration nation. We always talk about the importance of migration in Australia. This chart shows the quarterly net overseas migration intake since the Sydney Olympics. We got used to a certain kind of number of just plus 25,000 each quarter in the early 2000s. Then we essentially bit by bit amped this up, and eventually the pandemic hits. And we, for the first time in forever, essentially, saw more people leave Australia than coming to Australia. We saw negative net migration, absolutely rare. Before the pandemic, of course, we got used to about taking in 62,000 people or thereabouts per quarter. Very, very strong. Translates into about 240,000 people each year that we take in. We lose people to the pandemic, but then what happened in the last couple of years? Well, house prices go through the roofs. We have a housing affordability crisis, cost of living crisis, and then what does the mad government do? Well, they take in twice as many migrants in net terms as ever before. This is just political madness. This is the migration Ponzi scheme that we are running. This is absolutely scandalous what is occurring here. But I'd say, well, let's just average out a couple of numbers, huh? Turns out we've pretty much taken in exactly the same amount of people. The only reason why we had this insane, irresponsible spike in migration here is that we took in 3.5 years worth of international students in 1.5 years. This is already coming down. It was always going to come down. But this is, of course, a wonderful fear-mongering narrative for people who can't calculate averages. What will happen with migration into the future? Guess what? It will continue to go up. I'm actually very, very sad that the Liberals didn't get in at the last election, because they would have proven me right already by not cutting migration. There is no plausible government in our future that would cut migration intake. It is an absolutely ridiculous assumption to do this unless you talk about radical tax reform. Because what do we do as a country? How do we make our money? 52% of federal income is income tax. The treasurer will never allow the PM to cut migration. Yes, you can talk about it because it gets you a couple of votes, but don't actually cut it. That's what the Liberals have done the last time they were in power. They talked very tough about cutting migration by 50,000 people. Every year they were in power, we saw record high migration intake. Yeah? Disregard every politician who talks about cutting migration. The system by now is hooked on it. And we rely on it. And unless you talk about completely changing the way we tax Australians, high migration guaranteed to continue. So, now that we know how many of us there will be and who will be there, let's roughly try to figure out where we will live. And overwhelmingly, we will live in Melbourne. Melbourne will forever onwards be the fastest growing Australian city, growing by about 100,000 people compared to Sydney's 80,000 people per year, simply because we in Melbourne have no physical boundaries whatsoever. If Melbourne wants, they can continue urban sprawl until they hit Adelaide. There is nothing in the way. Sydney merrily sprawled, and then all of a sudden there were those darn blue mountains. And your wonderful riverways and oceans and bays is just horrible. So you couldn't sprawl no more. That, of course, means that Melbourne can grow at a much faster pace than other cities. And also, you will very, very soon see Melbourne become Australia's most affordable capital city. It will very soon be the fact, and then the Victorians will not, well, the Victorian Premier will not stop yapping on about this. Why will this be the case? Well, because Melbourne can build the cheapest housing in Australia. The cheapest housing is you bulldoze a bit of valuable farmland and you put a cheap box on top. Yeah? Costs about 1/3 per square meter of living space compared to building medium or high rise. Sydney needs to build up because they hit the Blue Mountains. That's expensive dwelling stock that you need to build. Melbourne, they can merrily continue to sprawl outwards, build the cheapest dwelling stock, and so they will become, technically speaking, the most affordable stuff. Unfortunately, urban sprawl means infrastructure. Infrastructure means more spending, means more maintenance costs and infrastructure backpack that you carry from budget to budget, which you increase, which is an absolutely fantastic idea if you are the broke state. But so this is the kind of system that the city and the state builds itself into, and we'll just continue our merry way this way. So we see massive growth on the outskirts of town where housing is cheap and affordable. Affordability is a relative term here because it is darn expensive. But mostly this is actually driven by demographics in the next 12 years. Because most of the millennial generation, the biggest generation, still live in the inner city hipster suburbs of Brunswick, of Surrey Hills, of Fortitude Valley, wherever it is. And now they are bit by bit, it started at the beginning of the pandemic, no relation to the lockdowns, just demographic dumb luck. Millennials started making babies. They add their 1.5 babies to their hipster apartment. The apartment becomes quite cramped with the pram and so forth, and so you need a bigger house. You need 3 bedrooms plus. You can't stay in your inner city hipster suburb, can you? Because there's no such dwelling stock available, let alone affordable. You can't do what your baby boomer parents have done when they were in the same position and move to the middle suburbs. Because your beloved baby boomer parents are hogging the 3 and 4 bedroom stock over there, and they have been fantastic NIMBYs over the last 4 decades and blocked any development. So that means the millennial generation all across Australia needs to jump from the inner suburbs to the urban fringe. We continue to grow the urban fringe like crazy. This is the fastest growing area around the country, wherever you look, particularly in Melbourne. This will, of course, be the case, guaranteed to occur. Very, very strong growth. But aren't we completely moving into the hinterland? Didn't we learn about Zoom and Microsoft Teams during the pandemic? Shouldn't we just finally settle the outback? Well, turns out we quite quickly realized that remote work is the wrong term. It is hybrid work. Because even if you work remotely most of the time, you need to come to the office realistically once or twice a week. And so it turns out that just psychologically speaking, we are not willing to drive more than 2 hours, even if we go to the office 1 day a week. And you see, the red bits is more than 2 hours away. You can draw this around any city in the world, actually. People don't do this. It's quite hilarious to me that we stick in this. So anything within the 2-hour magical drive time radius of our major CBDs will be crazy boomtown territory as long as building is available. You know, we still see in here the heaps of red little blobs in there in the middle suburbs. These are, of course, the millennials moving out of their baby boomer homes into the inner city first. And then, of course, you have baby boomer partners dying. And so, therefore, I guess they move out into the box. You could call them downsizers. But ultimately, this is the geographic shift that is guaranteed to happen. So what about housing affordability? Popular topic in Australia, a policy priority according to any politician. Allegedly, both parties, 3 parties, they all love making housing cheaper, more affordable. They say more affordable. You know, you couldn't get the housing minister under torture to say that housing should be cheaper. Yeah, it's always affordability. That's a word you're allowed to say. You're also allowed to say supply, but not make housing cheaper. Why? Why are we so obsessed with avoiding the term that housing might become cheaper? We don't talk about this. Well, and I think I might be able to answer why this is the case. Because ultimately, isn't there some sort of political reason why housing is expensive? Maybe this is expensive by choice, collectively speaking. Let's put yourselves into the shoes of a purely hypothetical politician. I'm not saying that they exist, but imagine, for the sake of argument, a self-interested politician that wants to be elected. Who would I make policy for? Well, not people who are just on temporary visas or anything like this. Screw them. Not those permanent residents who don't have a passport, the non-citizens. Screw them. Also, under 18-year-olds, they don't vote. They're pointless, so screw them. So that means I make policy for 64% of the population. That's the only, when we talk about politics, when we talk about housing affordability and any of those things, don't think about all of Australia, think about the 64%. Now let's zoom in a bit closer and imagine who those 64% are and what they do. Here is the 64%. Turns out that 26% of them, roughly a quarter, are renters. 40% are mortgage holders. The rest, a third of them, are owners. Okay, fair enough. So what does that mean? That means if I were to suggest that housing needs to become cheaper, who doesn't like it? Well, I guess these 74%. That's a big fat chunk of voters. I can't do this. If I ever were to suggest a policy that arguably might make housing cheaper, I might end up like Bill Shorten, who essentially said this and therefore managed to lose the unlosable election. And everyone since then, you know, kind of learned the lesson, didn't they? And so you say, okay, we really can't make housing cheaper. That's very, very unpopular. Maybe we can make it more affordable. But that's just really, affordability is a relationship between the money that you have and the price of the asset. So we can't give you much more money because we all actually give you more money. Wages keep rising. So that's not good. So maybe we can go into a lab and we can create a policy that looks like it makes housing cheaper while doing the exact opposite. That'd be awesome. And turns out we did it. First home buyer grants. You give $10,000, $20,000 to 10, 20,000 people, and you go, spend it on housing, but don't tell the market about it. So it doesn't factor it in. It is a criminal waste of public money. The only thing that's dumber than wasting public money on this is wasting your own money on it by using your own superannuation savings to drive up the price for the asset that you purchase. That is yet dumber. And these are all policies designed to cosplay housing affordability while doing the opposite. Guess what? Guess what? Who learns about this? Well, we'll look. I'll tell you this about later. So this is the background, what I think about policy and house prices. Now let's think about what Australian voting behavior looked like. And we have detailed data for this for every federal election going back to federation. This is literally my favorite Australian data set. It's absolutely fascinating. And I'm not interested in Labour or Liberals. I don't care. I'm only interested in all of the collective third parties. Everyone from the Greens to Pauline Hanson and Clive Palmer mushed together in one fun third party. That's who I root for. So let's have a look. At federation, less than 2% of us voted, not of us, very few people here voted at federation. Less than 2% of Australians voted to third parties. Well, then the First World War comes along. Our sons are dying overseas. Of course, we are a bit peeved. We look at fringe political solutions at a much higher rate then. It does make sense. Along comes the Great Depression. We literally can't feed our families. Second World War, our sons are dying overseas at very, very high numbers. Obviously, we don't like this. Then, of course, we flirt with the likes of communism and these political fringe ideologies. It does make an awful lot of sense to me. The war's over, prosperity, post-war economic boom times. We safely are in the hands of the two major parties. They get to take turns. And we see pretty much uninterrupted economic growth. It's kind of nice. Along comes the 1987 election. 2% of us vote for the third parties. Since then, yes, there was a bit of an economic crisis in the early 90s. Yes, there did end up to be economic slowdown, but still growth during the GFC. And then there was the pandemic years. But ultimately, what a ride it has been. These were 38 very, very successful years. And how did we thank our major parties for it? Well, we just continued to vote for the others. At the last election, we finally cracked a third of all votes going to third parties. Calling this a two-party system is increasingly a bit of a misnomer. It's really a three-party system in my way of calculating it. And I would argue that this chart, what would it look like in one election, two elections, three elections, four elections? What would be your best bet be? I'm absolutely certain that it will go up and up and up. And this is not just guesswork. There's a thing called the Australian Election Study, absolutely fascinating reading. After every Australian election, they interview 3,000 people in very, very great detail about their election behavior, about their political outlook, about their values, blah, blah, blah. Quick takeaway, summary, everyone under the age of 45 hates Labour and Liberal. That's the quick takeaway. They have zero party loyalty, zero party partisanship, zero repeat votes for the parties. So what does that mean? At every election, we kill 3 years' worth of loyal Labour and Liberal voters, gone, and we introduce instead of them 3 years' worth of people who hate Labour and Liberal. It's pretty easy to forecast this chart. Will there be a Labour Prime Minister or a Liberal Prime Minister? That's a bit of guesswork. Who knows? Depends on the mood. You know, we saw this great Labour landslide. It would have been a Liberal landslide if the election had been 4 months earlier. I'm convinced. Because back then, all the other elections around the world did just that. Why would we have been different? So it's a bit of Labour, Liberal, who cares? We ping-pong a bit. But what does this mean if we run this chart forward? This means that in 5 to 6 elections, we will not have Labour or Liberal prime ministers again. This is only 18 years away. At this point, this is absolutely written in stone in my reading. And I would say that already Labour and Liberal are under pretty much systemic life support because we force you to vote. This is why 90% of Australians vote. Imagine we had the American voting system where it is voluntary. How many of us would you think vote? In the US, it's 60%. I think we'd be very close to that. So we'd probably lose about 30% of people voting. These people that are voting, the non-voters, are almost always people that would vote Labour or Liberal. The fringe always is motivated. The fringe gets their votes in. Oh, that's already pretty rough. Preferential voting is what keeps them alive, and compulsory voting is what keeps them alive. This is major, major political disruptions is on the horizon. Not in the short-term horizon, but I'd say 18 years. And it's not going to be magically better. And the party in power is not founded yet, by the way. It will not be the Green Party. This is politically too fringe to be a majority party, but the new party might be founded. And I'm sure Clive Palmer gives it a healthy go again. But that's political disruption that I find scary. Because so far, one of our main sales points to the rest of the world is that we offer ridiculous stability. that while the world is more and more insecure, more and more unpredictable, we offer boring, stable prosperity. This is our sales point, and we are risking of losing this. And if I were to advise the major parties, I would tell them you need to much more aggressively make policies for the under 45-year-olds, which is mostly linked about they're interested in, well, they feel broke. So you need either to make housing cheaper, more affordable for them, or you need to massively make them richer by not taxing their income and taxing wealth in Australia. Is there any appetite for tax policy, tax reform like this? I don't see it. So I think we are probably inching towards more and more political disruption. I think that at the moment the major leaders of our major parties are just they're nailing coffins, nails into the coffins of their major parties. That's political disruptions at the horizon. That sounded more depressing than it should have been, because ultimately I still believe that the pie keeps growing, that we are a very, very wonderful destination. We have heaps of relative advantages. If there is global trade wars, global trade disruptions, climate change disruptions, these things hit us too, but they hit us much less than other regions. So this is where the term comparative advantage comes from. Very, very high consumption is what we are facing. This will mean many, many businesses will have a good time with it. Interest rates, I think money would probably be more expensive rather than less. Skills shortage, huge, huge, huge problem. Therefore, absolutely embrace modern technology. Migration definitely remains high, absolutely guaranteed. I find it laughable to think the opposite, because what else do you do? How do you fill your jobs? Where do you get your money from if you take migrants away? Yeah, but they are, politically speaking, a great scapegoat, so that you don't need to actively keep house prices down, because remember, the states make 60% or thereabouts of their money from property-related taxes, so they also don't want prices down. Also, the banking sector, you probably make the vast majority of your money through high interest rate, through mortgages, so lower mortgages, that would probably not be in your interest all that much. So we're kind of stuck in between a rock and a hard place, and I think we're inching this problem further down the road. I'm not predicting any major changes in there in the short to medium term. In the long term, these systemic changes kind of force themselves on us, and this would mean political disruption, which I don't think is overly great. So, quick reminder, the Demographer obviously has a social media channel for every generation. For the baby boomers in the room, I'm writing a column in a newspaper. For your young staff, I'm on TikTok. But for you, career-minded mob, I'm on LinkedIn. That's the QR code on the left. Make sure to connect, and thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. I love anyone who says in the course of a keynote speech, this is probably my favourite Australian data set. Big round of applause for Simon Kuestenmacher. Your desserts are about to be served. That's the end of the formalities for the evening. We still have the room for a while. Desserts and drinks to be served soon. Our band will be back in to entertain us. Enjoy. Another round of applause for Simon. That was wonderful, mate. Thank you.